Hey, Paul, thank you, man. I really appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure.
So, talk to me about this pre podcast career of yours. You're a very famous TV show host. You're making good money. You had a wife, and by society standards, you were very successful. But from what I've heard you say, it wasn't necessarily the way you felt.
No, my life on the outside was much different than how I felt inside. I was dealing with untreated alcoholism and drug addiction, just childhood trauma, just stuff I had really buried. And I was, as psychiatrists and therapists would say, I was self-medicating with drugs and alcohol to deal with the inner issues that I had no idea I was up against: depression, anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't until I got so yes, I had this career where, and I would not say very, very famous. I would say mildly famous at best. It was a show called Dinner and a Movie. It was on a channel called TBS, which was a cable channel, and we would show movies, and in between the breaks of the movies you would see us cooking a dish themed around the movie, myself, a female co-host, and a chef. And it I was lucky enough to do that show from 1995 to 2011. I was also doing stand-up at the same time, and I'd always imagined that if I could just get on TV, I would feel a sense of peace. And, I look back now and I laugh because it's so, haven't we seen like enough rock stars commit suicide to know that fame and money aren't, gonna be enough? And I remember one time looking at my face on a billboard and thinking that, it was going to somehow cure something in me, and just still feeling that emptiness and thinking, wow, there's something inside me that just is unquenchable. And I didn't know that it was related to drug addiction and alcoholism and a lack of a spiritual life and selfishness and fear and, et cetera, et cetera. And so it wasn't until I got sober in 2003 that I had a chance to even understand that my biggest problem was me. I thought it was the world, if people would just do what I wanted. And so getting sober really kind of became my rebirth, my second life, my chance at life with a more clear perspective on what's important, what my part is in things, what I can expect or not expect from other people, and what my meaning and purpose in life might be. And it wasn't until I went off my meds in 2010 and became suicidal, not knowing it was the depression and anxiety that came back, that I realized suddenly when I went, oh my God, this is the depression coming back. Wow, this needs to be talked about in a way that you don't hear on radio, because podcasts hadn't really taken off then. I had a friend who was doing one, and there was a few that were kind of on the national radar, but I wasn't aware of any mental health podcast that had discussions of it that were kind of raw and honest and, would have dirty jokes and dark humor. So I thought, well, why don't I start one? My intent not being that I'll be the solution to people's problems, but I'll be a comfort, because that's what I lacked in my life before I got help. Was I thought I was alone. I thought I was doomed, and I felt so lonely. And that contributes to the hopelessness. And so that was my hope, to be a mildly entertaining cheerleader for people to go get professional help. That's why I started it.
And your podcast is the Mental Illness Happy Hour. And would you mind giving just a brief explanation of what it's like, what an episode is like?
It's usually me interviewing a guest. That's about half of the show. And the other half of the show is me reading anonymous confessions filled out by listeners on the website. And it's usually a vulnerable conversation with a guest talking about any mental or emotional struggle, past or present. Sometimes it's a therapist or a psychiatrist, and then we're talking in more general terms about issues and tips for people, stuff like that. But through getting sober is where I really found the power of a person just telling their story. Not lecturing, not reciting facts. I always forget when somebody tells me, 46%, by lunchtime, I've forgotten everything they said. But I remember when somebody talks about, I was in the car alone at the top of a cliff, considering driving my car off, because I couldn't stop, drinking or, whatever it is.
And from your conversations and from your personal experience, when does depression turn from sadness, like just a down side or a down period in your life, to actual depression? How do we know that difference?
That's a great question. And somebody said to me once, I know that it's my depression and not my procrastination when I find myself uninterested in the things that normally bring me pleasure. Most people I know who battle depression, we don't necessarily experience it as sadness, though sometimes we do. We experience it as a lack of vitality, a feeling of dread, like a gray blanket has just been laid over our lives, and everything is muted. The color is taken out of everything, and everything feels like an effort. I know, I called myself lazy for the longest time, and I still do, but I like to think of it as, am I feeling inspired or am I not feeling inspired? Because, I taught myself how to make furniture, a third of, or maybe a quarter of the furniture in my house is stuff I designed and built. So I'm clearly not lazy. I just need to be inspired to do stuff. And I think for some people, that's who we are, but society places so much emphasis on doing rather than finding who we are authentically. Maybe that's just me making an excuse for playing too many video games. But that point of view has been added to the voices that bounce around my head, telling me, you're this, you're that, you should do more of this, you should do more of that. Because I know a lot of people that are successful and work their asses off, and they can't be intimate with another human being. They can't relax. So, it's not a cure for what's going on with you working. I know that sounds obvious, but yeah, I think you'll agree in our culture that we put people on a pedestal that are hugely financially successful, but we don't ask, how's their relationship with their partner, with their kids? When was the last time they took a day off and, just didn't do?
Yeah. And that's part of being a well-rounded human being. And we've just put so much emphasis on financial success that we often disregard everything else.
Yeah. And certainly there's a practical aspect, to that. We need to provide, if we have families, we need to provide for kids, or, we need to think about our future. But I think 99% of us spend too much time future tripping and not enough time just being in the present moment, because there's beauty and love all around us, as cheesy as it sounds. But if we can just be present, just surrender to the fact that we don't have control over the past, and we don't have the control over the future that we think we do, but we do have control over how we react to the present moment. That, to me, is where 99% of life and growth and authenticity is discovered and experienced, is in the present moment.
Yeah. And somebody told me once, a therapist actually, that anxiety, like if you're anxious, you're probably future oriented. And if you're depressed, you're probably past oriented.
Yeah,
so in order to be, fine, quote unquote, fine, you need to be more present oriented.
Yeah. As one of my friends says, keep your head where your feet are.
No, that's a good one, man. And I've always been curious as to how much depression's actually, a chemical imbalance, like something you're just born with, versus having those negative thoughts, negative rumination, and just being like very harsh on yourself.
Buddy, if I knew the answer to that question, I probably wouldn't need to do the podcast. I'd just direct people to the website that has the solution and the answer to that. Another reason why I started the podcast was there's so many different things that could be influencing why I feel good or don't feel good. Am I exercising? What's my diet like? How are my interpersonal relationships? Am I taking a real accurate look at my behavior and how it affects how I feel about myself or other people? Am I working in any way to make the world a better place? Am I apologizing when I'm wrong? Am I growing into the man that I want to be? Am I surrendering the things that I can't control? For me, playing hockey is a good litmus test of where I'm at spiritually. When I'm not doing good spiritually, I tend to boss people around, try to control aspects of the game. I get too hard on myself. I place too much of an emphasis on winning. The mirage that if I can just play well or we can win this game, then this feeling of discomfort in me is going to go away. And the answer is never that we just need to win. It's that, maybe I'm procrastinating some project that I need to do, and I'm feeling shame about it. And maybe I just need to pick up the phone and talk to somebody who understands and say, man, I'm feeling stuck. I don't know what to do. I can't bring myself to start this project. And I know it's important. I know I should be doing it. So, there's a vigilance in managing mental illness. And for me, a lot of it is trial and error, just saying, okay, I'm going to exercise more, or I'm going to clean up my diet, or I'm going to go to another support group meeting, or I'm going to talk on the phone more to people. It's throwing, as they say, throwing the spaghetti against the wall and seeing what sticks.
For sure. And I think that synergy of doing all these things combined definitely helps you get out of that hole,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And when you're in the other side of the phone, like a friend calls you or a family member calls you, and they're maybe feeling depressed or anxious because they can't get this project going, like, how should we act? Because there's definitely like no rule book, or people don't really talk about, when a family member dies and you need to, say sorry and stuff. Like, it's super hard to have these conversations. And you, as a person that's opened up with so many different people, how do you approach those conversations so that the other person doesn't feel like, oh, you're giving him advice, or how do you not make it worse?
I think you just said that is to not try to change that person, but to just be there to help them feel seen and heard and listened to, with the caveat that there are some people who will drain you, who don't have boundaries. And occasionally I will have to set a boundary with that person. There was a few people in my life that they would talk for 40 minutes without, asking, how are you doing? And I eventually had to say, hey, man, I feel like an audience member. I love you, but these conversations are draining me. And that was really, really scary for me to say that, because I want everybody to like me. I don't want anybody to, feel bad about themselves. But one of the things that I work on is the idea that there's almost nothing that we can't communicate if we can find the right way to say it, the right tone of voice, the right words at the right time. So, but basically listening is a huge one, and really, really taking in what they're saying. Try to imagine what it's like in their shoes. Almost every person I know who has had cancer has not benefited from somebody saying, you're going to beat it. You know, one guy, I said to him, I said, buddy, you must be scared. He said, thank you. Yes, I am. You're the first person that's asked me that.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel it's because we get most of our advice for those situations from like Hollywood, from watching movies. Like, yeah, you can do it. You know, like we get a lot of our romantic and a lot of our, you know, relationship advice from movies because it's just not talked about as much.
Yeah. And the American cliche is that we can overcome anything. No, we can't. There's lots of things we need to surrender to. And making peace with reality. And that's not to say you shouldn't do footwork involved in doing what you can to influence the situation. But, you know, a lot of it is just making peace with reality. And then that energy can be spent somewhere else. You know, swimming upstream your entire life is not healthy. It's not healthy. Finding the flow of reality and going with it, to me, is a really, really important part of staying mentally sane. So, yeah, I think getting rid of that idea that, you know, we can change or do anything, I think that can make us crazy, or that if there is a God, they're going to solve this problem the way I think it needs to be solved. For me, that's not the way. My belief in whatever benevolent force there might be out there in the universe, that's not my belief of how it works. My belief is that in the pain, in the struggle, there can be comfort in that connection to that thing. We can find the beauty and the love that is there. You know, one of the most extreme examples to me is from the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And he talks about the moments of beauty that he witnessed in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. The person who was starving, giving their lone crust of bread to somebody who was starving more. The songs they would sing at night. You know, that to me is where, if there is a God, where God exists, is in those moments.
And I want to go deeper into this, into going with the flow of life. And the way I'm understanding it, correct me if I'm wrong, is that whenever, let's say, you are going through a down moment, instead of just trying to ignore it, trying to avoid it, trying to put it in the back of your head, actually sitting still with this depression or with this sadness or whatever it might be, and sort of caring, being present in the suffering.
Yes. And one of the things that I do is that one of the first things I ask myself is there, you know, what are the emotions that I'm experiencing? Because a lot of times I don't even know what I'm feeling. A lot of times I just feel numb. So trying to identify, am I feeling sad? Am I worried? And, you know, if I am feeling worried, what fears are there? Because a lot of times fears that we haven't confronted or talked about out loud can kind of have a domino effect, you know, where we didn't get a job that we thought we were going to get. And in our brain, that thought tends to just pinball around so fast, we can't pin it down and really see what the facts are on the ground. So we think, well, nobody's ever going to hire me. I'm going to live in poverty the rest of my life. And in old age, I am just going to be in a horrible situation, in physical pain, alone, and suffering, eating cat food. And so you're sitting there feeling as if you are alone and eating cat food, when in reality, none of that is true. Everybody's brain doesn't work that way, but a lot of people I know, our brains do work that way. I can catastrophize with the best of them. And you know, asking myself when I'm feeling anxious or hopeless, am I catastrophizing something? You know, my therapist would always say to me, what are the facts on the ground? And the facts on the ground are usually not as dire as the pictures that my head paints. And so that's one of the tools I go to. Journaling is another great tool, because when we have to actually form a sentence to describe what we're feeling or thinking, we get more clarity around it. Sometimes just sitting and being curious about what it is that we're feeling. Boy, nothing is bringing me pleasure. I'm feeling like I want to crawl out of my skin, or the only thing I want to do is compulsive. Like I just want to play Civilization 5 for 9 hours. I'm a little bit in that place lately where it's just I picture myself playing that game. I feel a rush of adrenaline. It feels good. And I go do it, maybe not for 9 hours, but for 3 hours. And is that a bad thing to do? I don't know. Maybe not, but maybe there's a better choice. I don't know, but being at least curious about it is a good place to start because it comes from a place of non-judgment. And I think some of the greatest insights and growth that we can experience as human beings is coming at things from a place of non-judgment, either towards ourselves or other people. But it's hard. Easier said than done.
No, for sure. And what you talked about, the catastrophizing, the being curious, writing things down, you remind me a lot about what Stoicism and Willie B. Irvine. I don't know if you've heard about him.
No.
Well, you should definitely check him out. He'll be a great guest. He talks about Stoicism and how we could use Stoicism to maybe manage anger, to stop catastrophizing. And then one of the techniques that he mentions is the Stoic, the dichotomy of control, of which is basically jotting down what is within your control and what isn't, and just focusing on what's within your control. Because I love it. We often catastrophize because we're always thinking about the what if. Oh, what if I did this? Or what if I did that? Oh, what if I did this? But if we sort of try and focus on what we can do instead of what if I did this, or maybe if I do that, then it's something that's definitely worked a lot for me.
I couldn't agree more. Especially in America, we tend to be results oriented. And so we set out with a result in mind rather than saying, here's the footwork that I'm planning on. Having a plan B is considered such a failure in America when it's really one of the greatest things that you can do for your mental and emotional well-being, because to think we can control the universe the way the universe expands is so arrogant and foolish. But I love what that person says. To me, it's embodied in the Serenity Prayer, which I say every day. Grant me the serenity to control the things, to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And it's a lifelong process to understand what I can and can't control, especially people, especially results. And one of the things I hate the most is putting effort into something that doesn't work out. And yet, if you talk to people who are entrepreneurs or have achieved something in their life, whether it's personal or professional, they had to experience failures to learn the very things that they needed to achieve what they wanted to achieve. And so they had an attitude about quote unquote failure that maybe the average person has not found yet.
The Angela Duckworth, the growth mindset, really focusing on effort instead of results. Obviously, it's all easier said than done, but in a perfect world, we would focus on the efforts, not the results. We wouldn't catastrophize. We would only stick to what's within our control. So we could only try to do these things,
Yeah. And when we stop doing that, it's so much easier to stop trying to control other people, because when we're solely focused on the results of an outcome, we see people either as helpful or a hindrance to our results, rather than a human being that might have their own needs, their own failings, their own shortcomings. And that doesn't mean that we should enable people who are unhealthy and break promises and stuff like that, but we should be willing to accept that they are who they are. One of the things that's been helpful for me about being in support groups and looking at my past in an unflinching way and seeing how I hurt other people, how I fucked up, how I was arrogant, it helps me pause when I want to lash out at somebody else for not being who I think they needed to be in the moment, especially in traffic. One of the miracles to me is that I can experience someone cutting me off in traffic and to go from anger to a place of peace in 5 seconds. That to me is a miracle. I used to take it personally. I would tailgate them. I would, yell at them at the next stoplight. It's insane. That's insane. And so I think of in that moment when I feel that flash of anger, is that person being selfish? Yes, they're being selfish, but I've been selfish. And so I try to remember, wow, I'm grateful that I'm not in the headspace that person is in right now. They're running around filled with selfishness and fear. And that is a prison to be in that headspace. And so if I can just let them be a human being, not a doormat, not have myself be a doormat, but let them be a human being. It's so much easier to have a good day, to just not take it personally, to go, okay, if I'm going to get there 15 seconds later, that person doesn't think I'm a chump because they cut me off. There's a saying in the recovery community, if it's hysterical, it's historical. It's usually triggering some kind of, thought about myself from childhood that I'm not enough. I'm not worthy of respect. I'm not interesting enough. I'm invisible. My life, isn't worth remembering. Those are things that are from childhood for me. And I've had to face them playing hockey, in my professional career as a performer. And those moments can be, as cheesy as it sounds, can be gifts at finding out what I do have control of and what I don't. And it can send a message to me that, oh, here's something you might want to try to heal from, that feeling that you're not worthy of respect.
And how did you go about really uncovering those childhood traumas that you had? Because it's definitely not easy. And a lot of us, store away those bad memories from childhood, and they're super hard to uncover. So how'd you go about this?
Refraining from addictions that numb me and keep me from identifying what it is that I'm feeling. Then I was able, I'll use my relationship with my mom as an example. She was covertly incestuous with me when I was a kid. It wasn't stuff that was obvious, but there was a pattern of violation there that was really fucked up. And, my ex-wife, when we were married, had told me for 20 years, your mom is creepy. The way she talks to you, the way she touches you, you've not dealt with it. And it wasn't until 20, 25 years after she said that I finally experienced the truth, because I had to give weight to it. But to give weight to it, I had to really feel what it's like to be around her, rather than to be in a state of numbness because I'm just zoned out from video games or pornography or drinking or whatever it was. So once I began to say, wow, I feel drained when I'm around her. I don't feel safe when I'm around her. I remember telling her once, I don't feel safe around you. And she wasn't interested in why. Didn't ask a question, didn't comment on it. And that to me was an important piece of information in asking myself, do I want a relationship with this person? So I began to set boundaries, and she didn't respect the boundaries, and I eventually cut contact with her. But somewhere in there, I gave weight to the things that happened to me as a kid. And I was able to separate her culpability and whatever her intent was in doing these things from my feelings around them. What her intent was and whether she could be prosecuted just needed to be separated, because a lot of us will keep from exploring the pain of whether somebody abused us or not, based on whether or not we think that person would be found guilty in a court of law or what the public would think about it, rather than just saying to themselves, what if I'm not being a baby about this? What if that really was valid abuse? What's the next conversation in my support group about this? Talking to a picture of myself as a kid, boy, did that open the floodgates. I saw how innocent that kid was, and how my mom used me both, emotionally, mentally, sexually. I would say, I don't know if it was sexual for her, but I certainly experienced it as sexual. And it wasn't until I did those things that all the pain came out. But that was a touchstone for growth for me, because then I was able to be intimate with women after years of healing from it. And it's still a process, but I had to understand who my wall needs to be up around and who it doesn't. I had just put a wall up for people in general, but especially women. And so my only way to relate to women was to objectify them, to ironically do what was done to me by my mom. And I had to take ownership of that painful truth that I had, even though I didn't do it to a child, I did it to women. I hurt women. I was a pig. I used them. I cheated on my wife. And I had to say to myself, do I want to be that guy? I can't spend the rest of my life blaming my shitty childhood on my actions. Now that I know the cause and effect, the responsibility on me is to change, because I know there is help. Maybe my mom didn't even know there was something wrong, or that there was help. On some level, she had to know what she was doing was fucked up. But I can't control that. All I can control is the way I interact with her. And I got to a place where I had to say, it is not healthy for me to have contact with this person. I get depressed for 2 weeks after I talk to them. It's one of the things support groups taught me. And, I was in support groups for 10 years before I realized it's important to have compassion for others, but not at the expense of compassion for ourselves. And I had to begin taking care of that little kid that was still running in the show, that was still keeping people at bay, that wouldn't let them in, that wanted to play video games for 9 hours rather than crying or picking up a phone or, journaling, whatever it was. And in many ways, I still feel like a kid, that part of me that just wants to escape rather than to deal with feelings will probably always be there. But there is growing in me an adult that is willing to sit through the feelings and take the action that people before me have taken and said works.
That's tough, man. And I appreciate you sharing it, and thank you for your story. So it really, from what I understand, came down to a very tough decision for you of whether or not you wanted to keep this contact. Was it healthy? Was it not healthy? And I appreciate you for sharing that story, because I know this is something very common. This is something that happens a lot and is not talked about. And the people that it happens to, they don't really know what to do. So hearing this story can really help a lot of people out, man. So I appreciate it.
My pleasure. One of the things I learned in therapy is that one of the repercussions of experiencing sexual, physical, verbal abuse by a caregiver is that we will blame ourselves. We will say, well, I really did deserve that to happen to me, as a way of protecting that caregiver from culpability while we're in the house, because we don't have a choice. And it's easier to say, I'm a bad person, I don't deserve better, than to say, wow, I'm trapped with a predator for another 10 years.
Wow. Yeah. And then I could see how that psychologically that could potentially stay with you forever, and how it's really something that you have to tear down piece by piece.
Yeah. And especially if we're raised in a culture that is, you don't turn your back on your family. Yeah. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you do.
Yeah. We don't choose our family members, and not everyone is a great person,
Right.
Wow. So what I've understood from your story is that talking to people, really going to this AA meetings, opening up, like, is this what really helped you? Or how did you, what was the first step that you took to tear down this wall that you had regarding women, regarding the childhood troubles?
Let's just back up a second. And if you wouldn't mind editing out the mention of AA,
of course,
because I don't want to identify publicly, because not that I'm embarrassed to be an alcoholic, but I don't want to be people to think I'm a spokesperson for AA. So if you could just back up and ask that, just refer to it as support groups, that would be great.
Yeah, for sure. I know I could edit this whole part out. Don't worry. I know there's different like communities, like there's AA and others. I'm not really very aware of like what the difference is. So maybe I would love to, get illustrated on, okay, AA is a little bit more like this is more like that,
So what is the question? What are the different support groups out there?
Yeah. What are the different support groups out there, and like what's the difference between them?
Well, I don't want to come across as a spokesperson for any specific support groups, but I can tell you in general, there are 12-step based support groups, which have a tradition of anonymity in the public media, because they don't want to have any one person being an example of this support group, because every individual person is human. And, what if that person gets drunk? Then are people going to say, well, that support group doesn't work? So I can't speak about that per se. I do know that those programs work for a lot of people. There are support groups from the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Those can be helpful for people with a mental illness, for the loved ones of people with mental illnesses. Those are not anonymous. There can be group support meetings put on by a therapist. There can be outpatient support groups through rehabilitation facilities. There's a website called helpguide.org that has a list of a lot of different resources for support. Cool. So, that would be awesome. That would be my 2 cents on that.
I appreciate it. So let me go back to that original question, which was that how, once you realized that you had this childhood trauma, like what was the first step that you took? Was it looking for different support groups? Was it reading about it? What's the first step that you took?
All of the above. And I'm not sure what happened first. Actually, the first thing that happened was I stopped looking at pornography. I stopped acting out sexually. I started feeling my feelings rather than numbing them. And the feelings were very, very intense. And I went through a period of withdrawal where the memories weren't necessarily new, but the feelings around them were new and intense. And so I began sharing about them in my support group. I go to several support groups, but this one is based around intimacy, whether it's platonic or romantic. And I was so confused. I didn't know am I making too big of a deal? Is this the truth? Crying, just searching for like a new mommy. I felt like I was 5 years old. And it was really confusing and embarrassing. And I had no reason to be embarrassed, but I don't know anybody that processes childhood trauma that does it gracefully and in a manner that they are happy about. But that's another opportunity to love yourself and to let others love you unconditionally. And I began to find out who was safe and who wasn't, who listened, who really cared. I remember sharing the first time I really shared in detail about some of the stuff my mom had done. I was just looking at my shoes and crying. And I looked up and people in the support group were crying with me. And I had never felt that before. And that was an intimacy that changed my life because I felt validated. I felt the love I'd been looking for my whole life. And that was the beginning of me beginning to set boundaries for myself, to recognize other people's boundaries. And I have not done any of this perfectly. It's been a lot of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But that really got the ball rolling. And it probably took about 5 years before I felt like I needed a mommy to replace my mom, as embarrassing as that sounds to say that. It was very confusing, not linear, not graceful, but really, really important. And I've been able to be helpful to other people who are where I was and to lend them support, to let them know that they're not alone. If they're interested in suggestions, giving them suggestions on things to do or not do. So that's kind of the overall progress of it. And I have felt myself heal from that. I don't feel the just crushing guilt that I felt when I cut contact with my mom. It was just, the first couple of years were just horrible. I felt like the worst son in the world. And one of the reasons I think was because from a very early age, I was groomed to be her therapist, her sounding board. At 7, she was complaining to me about her marriage and breaking down and crying and saying she wanted to leave my dad. That robs you of something as a child, because it became all about her needs. And so I had to be the good boy because I didn't want her to cry and break down. And I got to miss out on experiencing just being a kid. That doesn't mean I didn't get to experience being a kid everywhere in my life, but it definitely stunted me as a person. And so when I broke down and cried and started that path of healing, it's like I was 5 years old again. And it's weird. It's just a weird experience, but it's also beautiful because having moments where you are your own best friend rather than your own worst enemy is a relief. To take a nap in the afternoon and not say, you lazy piece of shit, look at your gigantic to-do list that is coming up on a 3rd-year anniversary. How dare you take a nap, rather than to say, I feel like taking a nap. I'm tired. The world just feels like too much today. Some days the world is just too much. I'm not even tired. I just want to lay down and just not think about Earth.
And that compassion, like that self-compassion, is so easy to say and so hard to implement as well.
So hard. So it's easy to say to other people.
For sure.
And that's why support groups are helpful, because, there's a saying in support groups, why, one of the reasons why we need the guidance and support of other people is people will say, you can't really give yourself a haircut. You can't see the back of your own head. And yeah, maybe you can give yourself a haircut, but it's going to be pretty shitty. And why not? If somebody is willing to give you a haircut, why not? Why not let them? And that's kind of a metaphor for support groups. It's nice knowing you're not alone. And it's nice helping other people and feeling that what you went through maybe wasn't for nothing. And maybe that was your chosen path. Maybe there was a gift there inside that. And I do believe that I wasn't meant to live my entire life as a stand-up comedian or as a TV host. I was meant to have those experiences to bring me to the podcast, to make sense of my childhood, and to bring hope to other people. I do believe that. And there's a tremendous peace in feeling that.
Oh, for sure. And is that knowing that there's other people that have undergone something similar, that have a similar story, and that you're not alone. And at the end of the day, as you said in the beginning of the podcast, we don't necessarily take in statistics as much as computers do. We remember stories and everything, the Bible, all the most popular, most renowned, and most sought after works and pieces of advice are stories. They're not statistics.
Yeah. It's how we relate to each other. Or I suppose it's how we are able to make sense of how we relate to each other, what we mean to each other. There's nothing like a good story. And some of my support group meetings, man, they're better than the best movie I've ever seen. There's laughter, there's tears, there's poignancy. But more than anything, there's a feeling of being a part of something bigger than myself. And if I had just sat by myself in 2003 and said, I'm not going to ask for help, I can figure this on my own, I'm pretty sure I would be dead by now. I'm pretty sure I would be. And I would have missed out. I would have missed out on opening myself up and learning how awesome vulnerability can be, as terrifying as it is. It's an awesome feeling, and it gets me in touch with something inside me that I feel to my bones is authentic. And, that was it Maslow that has the hierarchy where the very top one of the pyramid is self-realization, getting to experience who you really are authentically. I've had glimpses of that, and it's pretty amazing.
For sure. And I think that being a part of something bigger than yourself is a huge part of that. And what you've done with the podcast, what you've done with your authenticity, I'm super glad that you didn't believe, the American model of, independence, that we could do everything by ourselves, that you don't need anyone else. Like, we are not, I know, even though it might be like a awesome capitalistic way of thinking when it comes to economics, it's not the way we've been hardwired. We weren't hardwired to be lone wolves. Like, we're hardwired to be in small communities and share stories by the fire. It's just the way we are.
We are social animals. And that doesn't mean that independence is ever a bad thing. There's lots of times when being independent is fantastic. But I think when we're dealing with mental illness or trauma or addiction, I think that is a time to be part of something bigger than yourself, because it just works. It just fucking works.
Yeah.
At least in my experience and in the experience of thousands and thousands of people that I know.
So lastly,
I know
Paul, oh, no, sorry.
I was just going to say, I know a lot of people that are dead that were just too smart, quote unquote, smart, and didn't think they needed anybody's help, didn't want to open up.
So if you could go back to 2003 and tell yourself a couple pieces of advice while you were undergoing that, what would you say to yourself?
Well, on that day that I first walked into a support group, I didn't realize when I sat up in bed that morning and felt those suicidal thoughts and just the feeling of dread. And I said to myself, and not being a religious person, I just said out loud, God, help me. I can't do this anymore. Something in me changed in that moment of surrender, in that moment of acceptance that I alone could not solve this issue. I would have said to myself, if I was sitting on the bed next to me, that is the most important phrase you will ever say in your life. And I would have high-fived me.
That's awesome. Can you repeat that phrase, please?
The thing I said to myself that morning was, God, help me. I can't do this anymore. And I would have said to myself, that's the most important phrase you will ever say in your life. And I would have high-fived me. and the sad me would have gone, get the fuck out of here. This is weird.
What did that phrase change in your mindset and in your life?
It let my protective armor down for a moment, enough to let people in to help me, to begin to deal with my arrogance and fear of intimacy and selfishness and all of the things that I couldn't see.
No, that's beautiful, Paul. I appreciate you taking your time, man. Is there anything else you want to say or anything you want to promote specifically?
Not really, just the podcast, Mental Illness Happy Hour. The website is mentalpod.com. Mentalpod is also the social media handle you can follow me at. But yeah, congrats on the work you're doing. It's always great having advocates for this. We can never have too many.
Awesome, man. No, I appreciate it. And I think what you've done is amazing. How have you managed to, stay consistent and stay at it for so long? What's your driving force behind the podcast specifically?
I guess that I feel like this is where I'm supposed to be. Maybe something else will come along where I'll be like, oh, it's time to transition to something else. But for right now, it just feels like it's where I'm supposed to be.
Awesome, man. And I know I've said it a lot, but I do appreciate what you do, man. And as a fellow podcaster myself, you're definitely somebody I look up to in the space. And thanks, man. Thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.